events, but they have different flavor to them, you know. Uranus, the revolutionary, the rebel, right? Meeting with Pluto, the Lord of transformation, death and rebirth. This is cathartic, revolutionary, very crazy change on the planet. I'll give you this list from the great researcher Richard Tarnas, whose book Cosmos and Psyche is pretty much the ultimate study in this topic of archetypal astrology, which is a way of studying history and looking at all of history through the lens of when this planet and this planet come together, what happens? What kinds of cultural figures show up? What kinds of events take place? What kinds of art movements happen on the planet? Richard spent 25 years writing this book. He's one of the most well-respected academics and astrologers on the planet right now. He teaches at California Institute of Integral Studies and in the Consciousness and Cosmology department. So what he's found with Uranus and Pluto coming together through a conjunction, through a square, 90 degrees, an opposition, or another, the opposite square, which is the waning square. These are all angles of tension, of dynamism, of change. The square is, well, let's look at the conjunction first. When the planets come together, there's like a seeding, like a new moon. It's the beginning of something. Energy can be kind of chaotic at that time because they're just like, the forces are merging, you know. When the square happens, there's a lot of dynamism, tension, conflict. There's a crisis in our consciousness. What are we going to do with this energy? How are we going to build a structure with it between these two planets? As opposed to like them just coming together and learning about each other. The opposition is a very intense angle, and it's like they're usually very kind of distinct forces that are kind of aligning with this planet's energy and this planet's energy in the culture. And then you have the other square, and it functions somewhat similarly to the first square, except it's more like, okay, we've gone through this whole cycle, now what are we going to do about it? So in the 60s, Uranus and Pluto came together in a conjunction for pretty much the entire decade. This is the 60s, right? There was also Saturn opposite this. So this was the structure, the system, the governments not wanting to allow for this cathartic, catalytic, revolutionary change, right? But you could see that there's a lot of chaos during that time. It was the beginning of something. Now Uranus and Pluto, 45 years later,
It's about time.
45 years later, are coming to the square, right? And what's happening is that during those who were born during the 60s are now coming to power. They are actually being very affected by this square now, right? And so it's like, what were the ideas we seeded that started their development in the 60s, and now how are we cultivating them? How are we grounding them? How are we building structures on them? So like, there was a big back to the earth movement in the 60s, right? Mm-hmm. And now it's like, now we have all different technologies that we didn't have back then, with renewable energies and sustainable energies, with the internet, to immediately get, I'm working on this thing, and you're working on that thing, and now, we can apply that.
Things we only dreamt of.
Yeah, it was, and
they were dreams.
They were dreams, and now there's an ability to actually like bring it into form. So these eco-villages, these eco-retreat centers, the earthships we were talking about, they are the evolution of what happened, what got seeded in the ideas during Uranus and Pluto in the 60s. And I'll give you some of these kind of key ideas that always take place during Uranus and Pluto, and a couple key historical cycles.
The dawning of the age of Aquarius.
Well, yes, this is part of it. So Uranus and Pluto. Widespread radical social and political change. Often destructive upheaval. Massive empowerment of revolutionary and rebellious impulse. Intensified artistic and intellectual creativity. Extremely rapid technological advancement. And remember, this is just Uranus and Pluto. And then we said what we said about Uranus and Aries. So it's up another notch because it's not any sign that Uranus is in. It's in Aries, the fastest sign of the zodiac, and the most competitive. An underlying spirit of restless experiment, drive for innovation, urge for freedom resulting in a revolt against oppression. Embrace of radical political philosophies. Well, except, it was the beginning of communism, it was all the socialism in the late 20s and 30s, it was huge, all these movements, all the totalitarian movements. Intensified collective will to bring forth a new world. Massive demographic shifts. This is the whole migration, immigration thing. This happened, for instance, in the 1840s when this was when Texas and California were annexed. It was the end of the Mexican-American War. What is happening now? What's happening in Arizona, in this country? It's like, what are the rights of immigrants? Now it's less about what the 60s civil rights movement were about, and now it's more about the civil rights for those who have immigrated. This is in Europe too, with Arab Europeans, those who have come from the Arabic countries, and there's clashes between people that were already there, and they're afraid of certain terrorist kinds of activities. It's the same kinds of ideas as what's happening here with struggles with the borders and everything like that. This is an updated version of things that happened back in the 1840s or in the 1920s and 30s. Fervent, often violent intensity, and excitement of moving rapidly towards new horizons. Uranus and Pluto were together during the French Revolution and the American Revolution. And they were, again, throughout the 60s, as we mentioned. Also, in the turn of the century, 1895 to 1907, 1896 to 1907, Richard Tarnas gives a very wide orb, or a wide conjunction of degrees, 15 degrees. So that's why you have about a 10-year span. But it's because energy kind of moves like this, right? You start to learn about it, and then it kind of peaks during the middle part of the cycle, and then you get the results of it, right? Radical labor movements throughout Europe and North America at the turn of the century. It was the foundation of the socialist parties in England, the U.S., Russia, and France. Figures like Emma Goldman and Eugene Debs, Upton Sinclair, all these reformers, radical leaders, revolutionary activities. China is always very big during the cycle. There was rebellions in China during pretty much every one of these revolutions in China. China's very quickly eclipsing the U.S. as the world power right now. Chinese nationalist government and the civil disobedient movements of Gandhi during the turn of the century there, which then were updated by Martin Luther King Jr. in the 1960s. Right? And then in the late 1840s and early 50s, most people in this country don't know, but there was a wave of revolutionary upheavals throughout every major European city. Within 1848, 1849, every major city was rioting, and it was about taxes. That's pretty much what's going on now. The whole Tea Party movement here, the movements in Greece and Spain and Portugal, all kinds of student protests. Student protests here, Berkeley campus, and big student protests in London right now about the cost of tuition, right? And so you get that sense of the Pluto power structures and the people, especially the youth. Uranus symbolizes the youth having a major battle with that square, right? And at the same time, it's incredibly exciting. That kind of tension builds this kind of innovative spirit artistically and through business and scientific advancement. And there's this new energy that's born during this time. So it's empowering, and it's daunting, and it's very strong energy. So one of the things I wanted to leave us with that is thinking about this movement towards a resource-based economy around the world. And this is something talked about quite a bit in some films and movements, like the Zeitgeist movement. There's been a few films, the Zeitgeist films, if you guys have watched those, they're for free on the internet. And a new film comes out this next week, and this is the third in the series. It's called Zeitgeist Moving Forward. There was Zeitgeist, then Zeitgeist Addendum, and then Zeitgeist Moving Forward. And this has created the Zeitgeist movement, which is in like over 60 countries right now. And it's been around for a couple of years, but I feel like this square now is really going to be the juice to like get it going very strongly. And it partners up with the movement or the group called the Venus Project, which is Venus, Florida, actually, where Jacques Fresco is. Jacques Fresco is a futurist, a very paradigm-shifting thinker, who's about 95 years old right now. He's very old, and he's very together. But he's been a futurist his whole life, an engineer. He's got a very Aquarian vision of society, and this is not only him. Other people have talked about this, but we're basically, and you can read this through some things on the website for the Venus Project. But that basically money is, that whole line from Pink Floyd, money is the root of all evil today. That once we get rid of the monetary system, then we can actually evolve as a civilization. And this is what the Zeitgeist films start to talk about, and how it's all bullshit, or like it's all created out of thin air, basically. And the whole idea of interest, and we've seen this is some of the energy of Pluto and Capricorn, which has been for the last couple of years, will be through the whole decade. Pluto lifts the veil on whatever sign it's in. It's showing you the underbelly, the unconscious energies that are operating there, and the shadow. Capricorn is the sign of governments, structures, systems, banking. So what have we had in the last couple of years? But we're seeing all the CEOs and the trillions of dollars, thrown down the drain to bail